In the broadest view, Lucah, Born of a Dream, is a semi-abstract, top-down Souls-like. You kill things to gain experience that you can spend to level up at campsites, using a campsite saves your game but respawns all the monsters around you, and there's an animation-driven combat system that has a stamina bar to control the flow of conflicts, and which uses iframes when dodging to help you avoid damage. You play as Lucah, an angel after apocalypse in paradise? A person caught in a dream wrestling with their subconscious anxieties? A lost soul wandering purgatory looking for release? All of the above? It's not really clear. They awaken in an unknown clearing with a vague sense that they've been there before, a vague sense that they must move forward, and a vague sense that the world is out to stop them. From there, Lucah sets out on their adventure, battling nightmares and finding memories of people they may have known along the way to whatever destination it is that keeps calling to them. It has a sketchy art style that at first blush looks amateurish for its primary colors and its low resolution, but it quickly becomes clear the game is using this abstract representation to invite your own interpretation of the game's world. Lucah's own marketing material mentions, quote, "Striking colors and evocative line work elicits an impressionistic sense of ambiguity and tension." And it really does feel that way. This is a Unity game, believe it or not, and it's not easy to make the engine look like this. And this sort of outline without details approach that begs players to fill in the blanks themselves is found throughout the whole work. If it isn't clear yet, the game is obtuse. Perhaps too obtuse. It uses abstract animations to convey the mental state of characters that may or may not be the protagonist. It cuts to full-screen text in an interactive fiction sort of interface when it wants to narrate. Characters are referred to by name some places, but other times are associated with a color or a particular sprite, making it hard to match names with sprites and thus know who did what, or who's talking to you when characters appear on screen. And this is what makes it hard for me to kind of spoil this game. First, because I'm not really sure that I've seen all of the branching narrative paths, and second, because I'm not even really sure what happened in the path I experienced. I have theories, but it's not the sort of game that's meant to be read literally. It's difficult to follow in order to invite interpretation, and the refusal to comfort or concede to its audience's needs from a narrative perspective is very art house game dev, but it never quite veers over into pretension. Its themes are pretty clear, it just doesn't tend to engage with them directly or in any literal way. It's all subtextual. The game's marketing might argue that its line-based art style is impressionistic, but I would argue it's a surrealist game at heart. Like the title implies, it's all about dream logic and dream feelings, deep-felt anxieties that manifest in abstract ways and in abstract iconography, half-remembered through bleary lines and neon colors cast against an endless void of black. And while a traditional here is a linear sequence of causal events narrative isn't really on the game's agenda, it regularly evokes a few recurring themes. Namely, a subdued queer subtext cast against a suffocating religious doctrine that seems to delight in self-denial and even self-harm. The game casually suggests that Lucah is non-binary. They use they-them pronouns, and it's established that one of the characters who knew you before you died? Or from your waking life? Or from the before-apocalypse times? Mentions that you go by a different name now than you did then. And one of the game's extended interactive fiction bits introduces two characters, Anna and Naomi, who are clearly in love with one another in a not-super-straight relationship. They also both have other names assigned to them by the church, which they are forced to repeat back to a Mother Olivia. It's unclear whether that's meant to be queer coding or just an identity one must present to the church versus a personal private identity, but it's easy to read it either way. And speaking of Mother Olivia, that brings us to the big, obvious theme of the whole game, religion. If there's one thing that is not at all subtle about the game's abstract imagery, it's the game's take on organized theology. The religious order of the land seems to at best enjoy the carnage wrought by and at worst actively control the nightmares that hunt you. Acolytes eternally self-flagellate while priests lead their flocks to the sacrifice, and cardinals oversee gladiatorial tournaments where children fight their nightmares for the entertainment of the clergy. For a game that is largely about abstract interpretation, there's not a lot of wiggle room here. Where the queer subtext is kind of a blink and you'll miss it thing, this is a hammer to the face and pops up pretty much consistently throughout the game. From the fact that Lucah has angel wings, to the fact that you can buy prayer beads to enhance how many upgrades called virtues you can equip, to the fact that all of the Kickstarter backers are various religious positions. The game is very much about wrestling with one's religion and theology, especially in a context where it's both your path to salvation and the thing that summons your nightmares. Finally, the game alludes to themes of suicide, self-harm, and depression. Again, there are the self-flagellating acolytes, but there's a lot more than that. Falling from heights is a recurring theme. It comes up again and again. Given the angel motif, it could be a metaphorical fall from grace, but I'm not so sure. There's also a lot of memories you collect about souls not wanting to exist, to find a way to stop waking from the dream, and struggling with finding meaning in what they sense is an eternal struggle without a point. It's heavy stuff, but because it's obliquely referenced through metaphor, it never feels overwhelming. Taken all together, these sort of underlying themes make it clear what the game is at least loosely about. It's a game about young, often queer-coded people fighting manifestations of their own nightmares and internal demons in the face of personal and systemic oblivion brought onto them by religious forces. But there are no details here. Ultimately, these ideas are drawn up like the game's art style, hinted at in sketches and flashes, but not really there, not fully fleshed out. You fill in the blanks with your views and your understanding of those themes, and I don't know if that's the right answer in a game that's gesturing at themes this heavy. It seems to be interested in evoking a specific, desperate, claustrophobic anxiety some people are probably all too familiar with and other people might not ever know. And I guess I'm not sure whether the developers would view that as a feature or a bug, given that the game is so interested in being open to interpretation otherwise. And all of that may sound like I just spoiled the game, but I really haven't. There are twists and turns and multiple endings, and I've barely mentioned any of the characters by name. Just high-level concepts and imagery. And the game is so cryptic about what's going on, I could show you spoilery scenes, and without any of the other context, they wouldn't necessarily mean anything anyways. Quotes where you don't know who's speaking, or why, or imagery that is abstract makes some more sense in context, but without any context, you're lost. Besides, if I'm being totally honest, it's the combat systems that are the real draw here. I mean, yeah, it's a Souls-like, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have an idea or two of its own to throw into the mix, the most notable of which is the rewind mechanic. Unlike Dark Souls, which has just monsters everywhere, Lucah Born of a Dream is actually kinda like Doom 2016. It has big arena fights that you get locked into when you trigger them. And if things start going bad for you, and they easily can, you can use one of your rewinds to start the encounter over. Your health goes back to what it was when the encounter started, and all of the monsters in the encounter are alive and at full health again, but it gives you another chance to use your skills to beat them more cleanly. It's a far more interesting mechanic than just having health files, though Lucah has a few of those too. It causes you to think about whether it's worth replaying an encounter in order to complete it more cleanly and with more health at the end, versus finishing the current encounter heavily damaged and just drinking one of those more limited health potions. If nothing else, it helps players learn the timing for parries and dodges because you can replay a specific encounter over quickly rather than in, say, Dark Souls, where dying on a new monster means trekking all the way back to it just to have another shot to learn how to handle it. Lucah also has familiars that float around their head and give them the ability to use ranged attacks. The developers balance this by having the familiars' attacks consume charge that you rebuild with melee attacks, giving the game a back and forth between melee and ranged, and giving you the ability to deal damage remotely when waiting for your stamina to recover without really opening up some easy cheese mechanic of just hitting the ranged attack. There are also a surprisingly robust number of attack styles, each with their own range, speed, and damage patterns. You can equip 2 at a time and shift between them whenever, and Lucah encourages you to mix and match your loadouts, putting different ranged familiars with different primary attack patterns all together, giving players the ability to set up dynamic builds that can vary in damage output, range, and speed. It's a surprisingly deep combat system for a game that's maybe only 4 to 5 hours long on the first playthrough. Speaking of length, the game also has something of a timer slowly counting down. That's your corruption meter. Hey, look at that, 2 games in a row with corruption meters. And every time you die, it fills up a little more. And towards the end of the game, there's also a transformation move that can increase your power and abilities temporarily, but also increases corruption growth. It isn't nearly as strict or as threatening as Prey Mooncrash's corruption meter. I finished my first playthrough comfortably under the 100% cap, and there are some ways to change it down the road that I don't want to spoil, but it does apply attention throughout the whole game, as each death or transformation comes at a cost of your humanity? Purity? Sense of self? Again, unclear. But it does a good job of adding tension and adding a cost to death without feeling like there's a sword of Damocles constantly hanging over your head, pushing you forward, now, go, faster. And I like that. None of that is to say the game's perfect. There are a few times where the bottom of the scene's geometry can block your fights, and not being able to see you or your enemies is kind of a big deal in a game like this. Also, enemies step back into attack patterns a little too quickly on rewinds, making it very possible you'll rewind straight into enemy slices and dices, which occasionally sucks. The game's difficulty also spikes way up towards the end on the good ending path, with a particularly difficult final boss that was satisfying to eventually beat, but incredibly frustrating to fight against. And after you beat the game, it's got a New Game Plus mode that is effectively a mad dash to the end, with a corruption bar that fills up way faster, but scores you on each combat encounter and lowers the corruption based on how well you do. So it turns the whole thing into sort of a speed run, perfect run challenge thing. I'm sure it will delight hardcore players and people really in love with perfecting parries and Souls-like combat systems or aiming for perfectly efficient runs, but it also makes what seems like the true end of the game ridiculously out of reach of the average player. Still, it's hard not to enjoy the game. The dreamlike space its narrative occupies might be hard to follow, but it's never dull, leading you from trailer parks to forests to subway systems to cities under construction to snowy mountain paths, creating a world that is rendered in rough scribbles but with just enough specific details to provoke you into envisioning them as more than just stock backgrounds. And hey, you can go to your familiar garden and hug all your pets, and I don't know, I think that's adorable. And honestly though, it just plays really well. Once you get into how to parry and avoid attacks and have a few of the better virtues like the one that slows down time after a successfully timed dodge, it turns into one of those synesthesic experiences where the screen is a blur of pixels and colors that looks impossible to read, but you know exactly what's going on because you're one with the game. In being so open to interpretation, Lucah risks confusing or even alienating its audience, but even if you aren't particularly interested in piecing together meaning in the story of sad angels haunted by nightmares, it's still a pretty phenomenal little game to play.